Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Statford Bridge Chelsea by the Numbers. Look, we got a fun one today because, and as you can see on my screen, if you're on the visual side, Chelsea won. Chelsea won big, and that's pretty nice. Chelsea beat West Ham 3-0 this weekend. The early kickoff on Saturday, West Ham away, that has been a bogey fixture for Chelsea in recent years. And it didn't feel like it at all. Chelsea score an early goal through Nico Jackson, 4th minute, drifts into the left channel, kills Edson Alvarez for pace, and scores a very lovely slipped finish. And from that point on, Chelsea were pretty comfortable. West Ham have a few shots from bad angles. They have more of the ball than Chelsea do, which is an unusual trend in Chelsea matches for the last 2 years, really now. And Chelsea were pretty comfortable. West Ham never really got anything very valuable. And Chelsea got good transition or good pseudo transition from a build over and over and over, and that's the game. And we're going to talk about this game, and then we're going to talk about Nico Jackson, who is not blossoming. He's just a fully bloomed flower at this point. And some interesting, I think, trend lines for what is going on with this team moving forward. So going into the game, I think there's a couple interesting takeaways. One is the fact that, like I said previously, West Ham outpossessed Chelsea. And so on the face of it, right, how much does that actually matter? And the answer is probably not at all. The Double Pivot podcast, Michael Cayley and Mike Goodman, who are kind of the very OG analytics podcast, they talked this week, or last week rather, about some of the early numerical trends in the season. And they brought up how what is becoming apparent is that the best teams are more comfortable with bad teams having the ball than previous iterations of the best teams. And what does that mean, right? So if you think about the best teams probably 5-6 years ago, even 4 years ago, up 2-0 against a team worse than them, they are pressing high to turn them over, to get the ball back, and to keep attacking. And what we have seen now through Liverpool this year under Arne Slot, more than under Jurgen Klopp, what we've seen with Arsenal under Arteta, what we have seen with City under Pep, what we have seen with Real Madrid, what we have seen with Bayern Munich, what we have seen with Chelsea this season, is that the best teams are much more comfortable with, like, all right, you're losing 2-0, you have the ball, figure it out. We're very happy to sit in our block and just rip you on the counter for the rest of the game. And that was very much the story of this game, was Chelsea let West Ham have the ball, Chelsea sat in their 4-4-2 block. Kudus created a couple interesting moments off the back of getting at Marc Cucurella, but really he has 0.2 XG, he takes 3 shots, he has 3 shot creating actions that don't really lead to anything of value. Like, at the end of the day, you'll live with that, really. And I have been quite surprised at how Enzo Maresca has been willing to defend with Chelsea. So if we kind of look at, and I had this set up to talk about something else, but I'd forgotten, and that's fine. But if we look at Chelsea's defensive action map on the Clockbot, right? And again, if you're listening along, like, you can go look this up on the Clockbot app, which is really, really great. There's a whole bunch of resources there to look at things. What we see when we look at the defensive action maps is, like, Chelsea didn't really do anything high up the pitch. Not high turnovers, not high interceptions, nothing really in terms of high defensive actions. And because you score in the fourth minute, it affords you that luxury of, like, we don't have to press. We can sit, we can play deep, we can counter. And I think that was really valuable for this team who, despite having a very increased point total from similar matches, we'll talk about that, the attack is still not really clicking, right? Like, you can still feel there's a lot of fruit to be harvested there. And it's not quite there. Like, we can see when we watch, and we can see it in the XG data, that this team is not producing at the same level as they were last year in terms of shot volume and in terms of XG. But being able to play on the counter, like we saw against Wolves, like we saw today, is really, really beneficial for this team. And as of yet, they haven't really had to play from behind to chase a game. The only game that happened in is the Man City game. And they didn't really create much to chase that game. So we'll see how that goes going forward. But for now, I think scoring early certainly helps. And it's I'm often made fun of on Twitter for saying, like, soccer's a lot easier when the ball goes in. And that's absolutely true. And that has been a very true story for this team so far. If we kind of talk more specifically about the game, I think one of the interesting things we saw about this game was the build change. And I feel like I'm saying this every single game with Enzo Maresca, and me pushing my glasses up as I say it's interesting to talk about how the build structure changed. Is very on brand. But we did see a very different build idea. And not very different, that's a bit of a stretch. But we saw Wesley Fofana start nominally as the right back. Tosin Adarabioyo started as the middle center back, and Levi Colwill as the left center back in the build, and that was the three. And this was the change that happened around the 60th minute against Bournemouth, where Axel Disasi had a not very good game, and Wesley Fofana being asked to build as a central passer did not really work. And this is where I thought Chelsea would go with their build. And the build was very comfortable. Very comfortable. If we look at things like the Mark R stats, Chelsea completed quite a high percentage of their deep builds in this game. Levi Colwill, there is an excellent Twitter comp of his passing, because he just had a scandalous game as a passer. There's a few clips, like there was one I tweeted before it got by the feds that was like just him breaking the lines with the most ridiculous pass, where like there's no lane, there's no gap, and he splits two players into Jackson's feet. And it's like, I don't even know how you saw the pass, let alone executed the pass. And that bodes well. And I think this is kind of where the team is right now, without Reece James and without Malo Gusto. Now, one of the other things we saw was a little bit more of Enzo deeper in the build, Enzo Fernandez deeper in the build, where they would build 4-2 with the double sixes in Caicedo and Enzo. And I thought that actually looked really good for Chelsea. I thought it was quite natural for them to play through West Ham's 5-4-1 that way. And I thought that worked quite well. But really, there's not that much to talk about in this game other than to talk about Nico Jackson. And we're going to talk about Nico Jackson after a short break for pod listeners. For video listeners, this comes straight to you. Here it is. Nico Jackson is bonkers. Okay? The easiest way to say this is that if I go to the Premier League and I go look at all the squad stats and I go look at XG, just nothing special, just straight up XG, there is one player in the whole league with more XG than him. And that is Erling Haaland, who is a cheat code. If I go by goals, there are two players with more goals than him, Luis Diaz and Erling Haaland. Great. If I go by XG per 90, and penalty expected goals and assists, there are two players ahead of him, Erling Haaland and Harvey Barnes on small minutes. Great. If I go by non-penalty XG per 90, there's Erling Haaland and Garnacho by a little bit in small minutes. The guy is on a heater, but it's not a heater. This is just what he is at this point. And I wanted to highlight in a very small minutes total, right? Like this is so small that we really like we're not talking about this in the super long term. But I wanted to show Jackson's 2024-2025 radar in comparison to his 2023-2024 radar, and to show that like really there's not much different here. It's just the ball is going in. The XG totals are a little bit higher. That, who knows? We'll see if that's real or if that's just a couple games. He has had stretches like this before for Chelsea. To me, the thing that is interesting to me is the shots have crept up a little bit. I'll be very curious to see if he goes from a 2.5 to a 3.5 guy. That's a huge benefit to him as a player. It's very hard to put up the XG totals he does with only 2.5 shots a game. But a 3.5 shots a game, that's a lot more sustainable. And on the flip side of that is that he's creating a little bit more as a passer in these early season games. And some of that is Cole Palmer, right? He's had a couple great assists to Cole Palmer. Some of that is Nani Madueke has been more of a shot-getting winger than someone like Mykhailo Mudryk playing a lot of minutes last year. That has been beneficial. Or Raheem Sterling, that has been beneficial. But I think at some point, Chelsea, as a fan group, but also as a club, are going to have to grapple with, and not grapple is probably too weird a word, but like at some point the club are going to have to look at this and say, why are we paying a huge amount of money for Victor Osimhen or Gyökeres or Sesko or whoever for a striker who is not as good as the striker we have? Now, the squad building flip side to that is Chelsea are going to play 60-odd games, 70 games. Nico Jackson is made of titanium and cannot play, and apparently can play every single minute, but probably can't, if we're being realistic. Imagine if you had two of him and another very good striker. That opens up a lot of options for you. Like we saw the benefit of Christopher Nkunku coming on as a 9 against Bournemouth, who's slightly different. And he scores a great goal. Sorry. And that I think is fun. But I think at some point we're going to have to just straight up acknowledge, and there's a lot of people who do, like there's a lot of people who have been very bullish on Nico Jackson for a long time. But at some point I think we have to be very bullish about and just honest with like he is one of the best young strikers in the world and maybe one of the best strikers in the world, period. Like if we were drafting strikers to select to build your team's attack around, right? All the clubs in the world sign up and they're like, all right, we're gonna divvy up the strikers via a draft. Like, how many strikers would you take ahead of Nico Jackson to build your club? Not just one season, not just one game. How many strikers would you take ahead of him to build your club? And you look at the global list of strikers and you're like, all right, I'm taking Erling Haaland 1. That's 100%. But you look after that and the list of strikers I would take ahead of Nico Jackson might just be Erling Haaland. If you call Mbappe a striker, I'd take Mbappe. If you don't, I think that's the whole list. And there's maybe other players who are a little bit better than him now, and I'm sure I would be surprised if he was the second highest scorer in Europe, but you never know. He doesn't take penalties. I don't think so. It's a lot, man. It's a lot. So I think he deserves some of his flowers. And at some point, when we've got a little bit more sample on this season, we'll talk more about some of the things he does really, really well. But his radars and his output always looks like there's this funny thing that if you look at kind of the older StatsBomb radars or any of the radars that people put out, there's kind of the same shape for every elite striker where like all the shot stuff is amazing. Lots of XG per shot, lots of goals, lots of shots, all this stuff, blah, 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 blah. And then like everything else is really small and it makes it look like a stingray. And Jackson is starting to look a little more stingray-y. Just do all the attacking stuff really well and like let's not worry about the interceptions and tackles. Don't worry about it, man. So we'll see how that goes, but it's really, really exciting. And I think part of why it's so exciting is because so far it has translated into really good season over season projections for Chelsea. If we look year over year, from an expected goal difference perspective, they are ahead of where they were last year, right? This one game, this West Ham game, flips it, basically. It was flipped when we looked at this last week. I also stripped penalties from this because I cannot remember the Twitter username, but somebody was like, hey, you need to take penalties out of this because there's a lot of penalties in these games. Chelsea get one against Man City, they get one against Palace, they get one against West Ham. West Ham also get one against them, whereas Chelsea have not had a penalty yet this year. And that is real. That's a big difference. That's like almost 3 expected goals, 2.5 expected goals. And that's a big swing. Huge swing on the goal difference. The XG, a little bit worse. That's a real thing. I'm pretty confident that's a real thing. At the same time, the XGA is better. Now, one of the things that, like, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of on this pod is that I think the group of teams that Chelsea have played this year, City, Wolves, Palace, Bournemouth, West Ham, I think is probably a worse group this season than it was last year, where, like, Wolves were comfortably a Premier League team last year. I think they will probably go down this year. Palace were very good the back half of last year. They have been very poor so far this year. Bournemouth are maybe the same, and West Ham are definitely worse post-Moyes. And so we'll see how that bears out, but I think metrics-wise, the shape of this is probably a little bit better for Chelsea. And then we've already talked about the shot stuff where I'm a little bit unhappy with the shot volume. But again, some of that is in the equivalent fixtures last year. We look at Bournemouth, it's 0-0 the whole game. Chelsea are knocking on the door. West Ham, they're losing, chasing the game. They're knocking on the door. Man City is a track meet. Wolves, they're losing, knocking on the door. Whereas the flip side of this is this year, Chelsea have been winning, and the other team is chasing them, and the shot volumes look a little bit different. So I think that all that bodes well. And what that looks like from a points projection standpoint is that Chelsea are 5 points ahead of where they were. Villa are 1 back, Spurs are 2 back, Newcastle are level, and United are level. Now, how much do I think this is gospel? Not really. How much do I think it's interesting so far through 5 game weeks? It's curious. I think one of the things I've maybe gotten wrong, and I'm kind of curious to see as more data comes in, is I don't think Villa and Spurs were particularly good last year. I thought they were sizably worse than Chelsea. However, through the games we've seen so far, if we go into the Premier League table and sort by expected goal difference, which is not everything through 5 games, Villa and Spurs are both at about plus 3.5, and Chelsea are more like plus 2. They have played a very different set of opponents. I think Villa have probably played a slightly easier schedule, right? Leicester, Everton, Wolves, West Ham, and Arsenal is probably an easier set of schedule. Spurs, Leicester, Everton, Newcastle, Arsenal, Brentford is probably a little bit more difficult than Chelsea's, are about the same. But both of those teams, and to be fair, Spurs, almost all of their expected goal differences from them absolutely destroying Brentford this week. But both of those teams have been a little bit better than I have anticipated. And Villa have put up a very solid points total so far. But if we look at the year-over-year comparison, they're 1 point behind where they were. And I think a really important thing for Chelsea is that these points are on the board while we figure it out. Last year, it took Poch some time. The metrics were good, not great, good in the first third of the season. Really solid performances, but the results didn't happen. So that when that middle third of the season came, where your squad is small, fixture congestion is crazy, the performances dip pretty significantly, right? Like if we go back and look kind of at the historical, if we go back and look at the historical expected goals, running expected goal difference tallies and the kind of trend lines throughout the season, Chelsea were really bad in the middle of the season under Mauricio Pochettino. And that is pretty difficult to accommodate when you don't put points on the board in the first third of the season. And I think it's going to be very, very, very critical for Chelsea that through what has been Not an easy schedule, not a hard schedule. They've put 10 points from 15 on the board. And 10 points from 15 over the course of the season is probably enough to get you there, but maybe not. But it's difficult if you don't put those points on the board now. So we will see where Chelsea go from here. But I think it was a good win. It was a good week. Chelsea played Barrow midweek. We'll have another episode of the podcast, probably just audio only, after the Barrow game. There will be no stream after that game, of course, because of day jobs and all that. But if you're liking the content, if you want to see more of it, if there's things you want to see, let me know. Retweet it, share it, like it on YouTube, Twitter, whatever you want. But that's going to be all from me today. And as always, enjoy the soccer.